Hello and welcome to Michael's Minty Music for today. Today we review Duran Duran's 1990 album Liberty. It's alright. There are a few songs here that are pretty good, but most of them are kind of boring. This is the track listing, and these are the tracks added to my playlist, 5 out of 11, so just one under half. This album is alright overall, but most of the tracks are not great. Especially the beginning, aside from the opening track, the first couple of tracks on the album are all just really boring pop tunes. Fortunately, there are some pretty good tracks by the time you get about halfway through the album, but they aren't incredible or anything. Second half of the album is definitely better than the first. It's got some more experimental electronic sounds, combined with some classic guitar parts, which work pretty well. There are still some not great tracks though, so it doesn't really get perfect any point here. The album doesn't really flow for the first half since most of the songs are at the same speed, and although they all sound different, none of them sound interesting. The flow really starts up with All Along the Water, which kind of introduces the back half of the album. At that point, the flow is more balanced, kind of moving towards a slow finish, but it doesn't really gain enough speed to actually slow down meaningfully, so it just kind of goes back and forth between My Antarctica, First Impressions, and then Read My Lips into all the way down to Downtown. I will say Violence of Summer is a great opening track and Downtown is a great closer, so in that regard they haven't done poorly, but there's definitely improvements to be made here. The genre is a super generic sounding mix of pop and rock from the late 80s, which works on some of the tracks, but doesn't work on all of them. Stuff like First Impression and Downtown work pretty well with that, but stuff like Liberty and Hothead are just not the same. There was only one single released before the album, which is the opening track, Violence of Summer. None of the songs here were particularly popular on the radio at the time. Maybe Violence of Summer you might have heard, but the rest of them definitely not. My favorite track here is definitely First Impression. It's a great rock track that gives the album a boost of speed right where it needs it, and it works really well on its own. Definitely the good one from this album, in my opinion. I rank this album 9th out of Duran Duran's 16 albums, so the top of the bottom half. This is the middle album in a series of 3 albums, which are all kind of experimental, but not exactly in a good way. Big Thing, Liberty, and the Wedding album all have some good songs on them, but don't come together very well due to most of the songs being boring or way too out there to be good. Big Thing is more consistent in its sound, while the Wedding album is probably the least consistent, so Liberty sits kind of right between them. It's got more consistency than the Wedding album, but not quite coming together as well as Big Thing. It's kind of in the middle. Some tracks here are pretty good, but I think there are some tracks on the Wedding album which are better. But overall, with the back half of the album of Liberty kind of coming together alright, it's better than Duran Duran, the Wedding album from 1993, but it doesn't come together quite as well as Big Thing. It's definitely better than everything under that, just from a consistent tracks perspective, and it's not as good as anything above Big Thing. Additionally, this album doesn't take my top spot from 1990. That goes to In Excess's album X, which is much more consistently good album than Liberty, for sure. There's just more tracks on X that are better, and overall it comes together better and has a better sound. Next up is the Velvet Underground's 1970 album Loaded. This is one of their final albums, and I'm interested to see where they kind of sit at the beginning of the 70s. They don't really get too far into the 70s. They're mostly a 60s band, late 60s band, but this is one of 2 albums that they released in the 70s, so I'm interested to see if it's changed or if it's still kind of the same fare. So stay tuned for that, and as always, stay minty.